Imagine an America that seals itself behind a permanent 15% tariff wall, not as a temporary negotiating tactic, but as an enduring economic policy. Imports, no matter their origin, are taxed at a flat rate. Trade partners retaliate, supply chains splinter, and the steady hum of global commerce begins to falter. But for now, let's say Washington holds firm. There's no backpedaling, no renegotiation, no coordinated global response, only unilateral friction embedded into the arteries of international trade. Meanwhile, the Inflation Reduction Act is dismantled piece by piece, as subsidies for solar, wind, and battery storage are stripped away or left to expire. Grid-scale clean energy investments dry up. Battery factories halt expansion. The utilities, anticipating demand and fearing reliability gaps, look to natural gas. But a regulatory backlog stalls turbine permits and construction for years. So while the country talks tough about American energy independence, it quietly returns to aging coal and legacy gas assets, gridlocked in a 20th century framework that cannot scale to 21st century needs. And then comes the inflation. Not the speculative asset inflation of the 2010s or the transient post-pandemic spike, but the creeping, inescapable inflation of structural failure. With tariffs permanently inflating the cost of imported goods and energy prices spiking from supply bottlenecks, prices begin to climb across the board. There is no soft landing this time, because this is not a monetary phenomenon. It's a capacity crisis. There are no new turbines, no new solar arrays, no battery reserves to shave peak demand or stabilize grids. The dollar buys less electricity, less steel, fewer semiconductors, fewer groceries. Inflation is no longer a spike, but a baseline. And yet, there is no political appetite to expand the safety net. In this scenario, the federal government holds back cost of living adjustments under the premise of fiscal restraint. Social Security recipients see paltry annual increases. Public sector workers face wage freezes. And the private sector, facing declining demand and rising input costs, cuts hours and slashes benefits. What emerges is a bifurcated economy in which prices race ahead of incomes, not just temporarily, but structurally. Rent, food, energy, and insurance consume larger shares of household budgets. Marginal consumers are squeezed out of the market, leaving businesses to chase shrinking demand. For years, financial markets have thrived on the premise that inflation can be contained and growth can be monetized. But in this scenario, those assumptions begin to break. Mortgage holders with 3% loans seem poised to ride out the storm until they realize that inflation has made their wages stagnant and their home insurance and maintenance costs unaffordable. Fixed income investors, especially those holding mortgage-backed securities, MBS, and collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, watch in horror as the real value of their cash flows collapses. These instruments, once the darling of pension funds and risk-averse portfolios, are anchored in an economic model where inflation is modest, wages are rising, and consumers are solvent. Remove those pillars, and the logic dissolves. Cash flows remain nominally intact, but their purchasing power deteriorates quarter after quarter. A 3% yield on a 30-year MBS becomes laughable in an environment with 7% annual inflation and stagnant wage growth. Then come the defaults. Homeowners who bought at inflated prices, assuming future wage growth or stable operating costs, begin to fall behind. CDO trenches, once rated AAA, become watch list candidates. The same Wall Street firms that once built financial pyramids out of mortgages now find themselves holding melting blocks of ice. As inflation hollows out consumer spending and financial confidence, corporate earnings falter. Stock buybacks slow. The speculative gloss that once lifted tech and consumer brands evaporates. Even defensive stops, utilities, healthcare, insurance, find themselves caught in the crossfire. Their costs are rising, their customers are squeezed, and their supply chains are increasingly fractured by trade friction and tariff walls. The S&P 500, already disconnected from real-world productivity for over a decade, begins a long correction, not because of a crash, but because of decay. Investors flee U.S. equities, not all at once, but steadily, as better returns are found elsewhere, or nowhere at all. With the dollar weakened by declining global demand for treasuries, foreign capital stops flowing into American markets. Sovereign wealth funds diversify away from U.S. assets. The global privilege of dollar-denominated investment erodes not with a bang, but with attrition. Most inflation stories focus on how rising prices hurt the poor. But this one reveals the inverse. How inflation, if left unchecked and politically unsupported by real investment, can obliterate the accumulated wealth of the asset class itself. Fixed income investors, retirees, MBS holders, and stock market bulls all find themselves trapped in a monetary regime built for a different world. The cruel irony is that the same political ideology that championed austerity, deregulation, and trade friction in the name of protecting wealth has instead engineered its erosion. The wealth didn't disappear. It simply couldn't hold its value in a system where investment was choked off. Energy systems were allowed to decay, and the cost of living raced ahead of the human beings supposed to sustain it. This is not a crisis of taxation or deficits. It's a crisis of infrastructure abandonment and economic myopia. Eventually, the political consequences arrive. Populist backlash intensifies. Regional blackouts, rising crime, hollowed-out cities, and bankrupt pension funds become flashpoints for political upheaval. Yet the damage is already done. The institutional investors holding the mortgage-backed securities, the suburban families counting on home equity, the pensioners clinging to fixed annuities, all discover that paper wealth is no match for real-world inflation when there's no investment to back it. Wealth, in the end, is only as stable as the systems that support it. And in this scenario, those systems were left to rot, sabotaged by ideology, starved by austerity, and drowned in inflation of their own making. This is a speculative scenario, but not a fantastical one. It merely follows the logic of current policy trends to their plausible outcomes. When investment in real capacity is abandoned and tariffs are used as blunt instruments of nationalism, inflation is not tamed, it is seeded. And when real incomes fail to rise alongside prices, the asset class cannot remain immune. No spreadsheet survives contact with economic entropy. The wealthiest may assume they can weather this storm. But storms do not ask permission before they flatten the coast.